Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. Tonight, we're going to be talking about David almost becoming king of United Israel and the tying up of loose ends that came before that. Good evening, John. It's good to have you here tonight. Everybody, as you join in, please feel free to say hello. Tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. We are doing a survey of the Bible, one story at a time. I'm sending out a paraphrasing each week. If you would like a copy of the paraphrasing that I'm sending out, just email the email address you see on your screen there, and I will add you to our our mailing list. Good evening, Mike and Kim from Frederick, and John, of course, is from Hagerstown, and we'll have some more folks say hi in a minute, I'm sure. I did get a question tonight, and I will address it. If you have any questions each week, if there's anything in the story that you didn't understand, or if I made an error in the text that makes it nonsensical, by all means, send me an email and let me know so I can address it. You can always also put questions in the chat as we go. Good evening, Judy. So I believe we will be meeting every week for the next couple weeks. Then we'll be taking a week off, and then we'll be coming back in, and we can talk more about that later. I said I was going to send you all an email about that, didn't I? I'll send you an email, let you know what our upcoming schedule is going to be. Good evening, Stella. Everybody, I want you all to know that Stella had a birthday that she missed, and my daughter is interrupting me through the window while I'm trying to lead class. Yeah. Happy birthday, Stella. Charles, good evening. Barbara, good evening. Good to have everybody here. All right, so if you've missed any, and somebody said, did I miss a week? It's funny because I thought the same thing. I was looking at the text that I was doing, and I thought to myself, did I pick back up in the right spot? And I went back and looked at it, and I did. It's just a little confusing here, so we'll talk about that and get everybody straightened out. All right, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. All righty, so tonight, loose ends are being tied up, but not by David, but they are loose ends that will, at least in some ways, benefit David. So, when last we left off, okay, David had become king of the southern portion of Israel. Saul has died. Two of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, have died. He was the king of the northern part. He was the king of the northern part of Israel. His top general was Abner, and he had a remaining son, Ishbosheth, or Ishbaal, depending on which part of the Old Testament you're reading. Ishbaal and Abner, Abner decided to help Ishbosheth become king. There's an assumption that Abner was going to use him as a puppet king. We don't really know that, but so Ishbosheth became king of the northern tribes, and then David and Abner's forces went to war. Now, David's general is named Joab, and the northern general is named Abner. Okay, so Abner had been Saul's general. Now he's Ishbosheth's general, Saul's son. Joab has been David's general from the beginning. So there was a falling out at the end of last week's lesson, or in the middle of last week's lesson. There was a falling out between Abner and Ishbosheth because Ishbosheth accused Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, which usually is perceived as a power play when you do something like that. Abner denied it, split ties with Ishbosheth, and gave his allegiance to David, came to David and said, "Hey, David, I want to stop this war now. I've turned my back on Saul's son. I'm willing to put my allegiance to you, and I'm willing to travel around all the tribes, all the northern tribes, and talk to them and get them to put your allegiance to you too, and then you will be the undisputed king of unified Israel." And David's response was, "Well, I had a wife that was Saul's daughter Michal, and she was taken from me when I had to flee from Saul. If you give her back to me," actually he asked Ishbosheth to do this, and the point is they said, "Okay, fine, you can have your wife back, your first wife back." He had other wives at this point too, but he wanted his first wife back in addition. So that's where everything ended last week. So Abner has turned his back on Saul's remaining son, thrown his weight with David, and looks like everything is going to be okay, but it's not. So this is where we pick up this week. Shortly after Abner left Hebron, Joab returned from a raid with David's army. When he arrived, he heard that King David had met with Abner and had let him go. So he went to David and said, "What were you thinking? Abner was here and you let him go? You can't really believe he came here in good faith. He came here to spy on you." And Joab stormed off without telling David what he planned to do. He sent men to chase after Abner and bring him back under false pretenses. When Abner returned to Hebron, Joab pulled him aside. He acted as if he just wanted to speak with him privately, but then he stabbed him in the stomach to avenge his brother's death. And when David heard what had happened, he was furious. And he said, "I had nothing to do with this. Curse Joab. I hope everyone in his family ends up either sick, crippled, murdered, or starved to death." And David ordered all the people, including Joab, to publicly mourn for Abner when they buried him. They all tore their clothes, wore sackcloth, and wept. David refused to eat for the rest of the day, and this impressed the people. David told his advisors, "I might be king, but I can't control Joab. God is the only one who can hold him accountable, and I pray that he does." When Saul's surviving family members heard that Abner had been killed, they panicked. Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, I cannot say these names, Mephibosheth, was only 5 years old. Now, Jonathan was the son of Saul that was David's best friend, okay? Jonathan's son was 5 years old. His nurse picked him up and tried to escape with him, but she fell and broke his feet. He was never able to walk again after that. The two brothers snuck into Ishbosheth's house, this is the remaining son who had been made king of the north, and killed him in his sleep. They cut off his head and took it to David, thinking they would be rewarded. But he had them killed on the spot, and they buried the head with Abner. Okay, I hope that made sense. Okay, thank you, Michael, for wishing Stella a happy birthday, and Kayleen, good to have you with us as well. All right, so when it said that Joab killed Abner to avenge his brother, you may remember that Joab and his brothers all were in David's army, and, well, most of them were anyway, and they were fighting in this war between David and Ishbosheth, and one of Joab's brothers chased after Abner, and he was not a match for Abner. And Abner had told him, "Stop, I don't want to kill you." And he insisted on going hand to hand with him, and he ended up killing Joab's brother. So Joab wants revenge for this. Now, in this point in history, there was no legal system. So when somebody was murdered, justice blood justice was what was carried out. So if someone was murdered, that person's family was responsible for getting justice for the person who was murdered. So generally speaking, if you murdered somebody and people found out who did it, the family of the guy you murdered was going to come after you, and they were going to get you. Okay, and then your family would have to make a judgment call. Well, did he really have it coming, or was it more complicated than that? And if they didn't want to escalate things, they would just let it lie with that. But if they felt that they had been wronged, then things would escalate and things would sometimes get out of control. But here's the thing: murder, according to the Bible, is an unjustifiable killing. Not every killing is a murder. And the law governing blood justice specifically said that people who were killed in legitimate combat were not murdered. And you could not avenge the death of someone who died in combat, because, wars would never end if you did that. Good evening, Roseanne. Good evening, Amanda. So Joab was in the wrong to avenge his brother by killing the enemy general. Absolutely illegal. Okay, so, like I said, in today's story, David's loose ends have been tied up in that the other guy who tried to become king is now dead, and his top general is now dead. Now, does that play out for David's interests? And that's a good question. There is a modern cynical read on this story that claims that David is actually the architect of both deaths. So when Joab went out and killed Abner, he was actually doing that under David's orders. And when these two brothers went and killed Ishbosheth, they were actually acting under David's orders as well. And David's displeasure with all three of them is feigned. It's just for show. And that these two, so he killed two guys that he actually hired to do a dirty job for him. Now, so in that view, what they're saying is, okay, so it's in the text. The text goes out of its way to show that David had nothing to do and had no knowledge of Abner being killed or Ishbosheth being killed. That he did not order the killings, he did not know about them until afterwards. And this theory would say that the text says that because this text is actually David's propaganda, and that it does that because his purpose was to cover his tracks after doing these things. The thing is, though, there's no evidence of this in the text. There's no hint in the text that that is what is going on. And given the way the Bible generally deals with the faults of leaders, that's not consistent, including David. David is going to do a lot of bad stuff in the future, and the text is going to be very frank about showing his moral failures. So for this one story to be an exception to that rule does not make sense to me. Also, it doesn't make sense it does not make sense for David to order Abner's death, because it probably hurt him more than it helped him. Abner was going out to shore up support for David becoming king of the entire country, and Abner and David both have support in the northern kingdom, so that would have been Abner suddenly being murdered in cold blood does not play well for David's diplomatic efforts with the northern kingdom. So he needed Abner's support. So Abner dying does not make David's job easier, but it makes Joab's job easier. Because remember, Joab was David's general, and Abner was Saul's general, and then Ishbosheth's general. I believe Abner actually has more combat experience than Joab does. I don't know which one of them was actually the better general. David's people were winning the war, so probably Joab was. But something that David might have decided to do to shore up his new kingdom would be to make Abner his top general. Joab doesn't have to worry about that anymore. Now there's only one general now, not two. So Joab definitely had something to gain from this, in addition to just the anger over his brother being killed. I also want to point out that David promised Saul, while Saul was still alive, that he would not seek revenge against Saul's family for any of the things that Saul had done. Saul said, promise me. Saul said to David a few weeks back, you may remember, he said, look, I know that someday you're going to end up being king, and I know that none of my sons are going to end up being king. Please just promise me that you won't kill them. And David said, I promise, I will not. This is between you and me. And of course, David wouldn't kill Saul either. He let other people do that. He let that story play itself out. So I believe that David meant to be true to that promise. And as evidence for that, so Jonathan's son, whose feet were broken in the story and was lame forever, David did right by him. He never he protected him, and didn't just protect him, gave him a place to live, gave him a stipend, so he wouldn't have to worry about anything for the rest of his life. And also Saul's concubine that Abner may or may not have had the affair with, David does right by her too. So I don't believe that David had anything to do with Joab being killed. Now, the interesting thing here, and I don't think he had anything to do with Ishbosheth being killed either, is what I'm saying. If he had Ishbosheth killed, why would he have stopped there? Why wouldn't he have also had the other, the grandson killed? I think he would have. Anyway, the interesting thing is, though, the guys who killed Ishbosheth, David has killed immediately. Joab, who murdered Abner, he doesn't do anything for him. The only thing he does to him is to publicly humiliate him by ordering him to publicly mourn the death of the guy he had just killed, who had killed his brother. That's all David does to Joab. Now, why is that? Why does he not do any more? Not that it was a bitter pill for Joab to have to publicly grieve Abner, but he really should have been killed for what he had done. It was a very serious offense to avenge a wartime death by assassinating a general after the fact, while your nation is in diplomatic relations with this general. That's not just murder, it's treason. Okay, by all rights, Joab should have been executed for this, but he didn't. Why? Is it because he's David's uncle? Maybe. Is it because David needs him for dirty work that he's still got to get done? Maybe, because Joab will always be there for David when David needs dirty work done. And sometimes David will ask, and sometimes he won't even have to. Joab will just go out and do it. He'll make an executive decision. He's like, I know this needs to be done. I know David's not going to give the order, so I'm just going to do it. That could be it. Or is it because David is actually afraid of Joab? He kind of says that. He says, I might be king, but I can't control this guy. Only God can. I hope God someday holds this guy accountable. So it would seem that David thinks that it would be difficult to hold Joab accountable, if not impossible to hold him accountable. So maybe it's a bit all of these things. Maybe he knows that Joab is dangerous, so he would rather be on his good side than try to go up against him one-on-one, at least for now. Okay. So what does this story tell us about God? So God is invoked in this story, but he's not involved in any of these actions. Now, one commentator points out that the text says several times, many times, that David is God's anointed, right? It says the Lord is with David. Never says the Lord is with Joab. Joab is not the Lord's favorite guy. Whatever he does, he's doing it without help from God. So the question is, does David really need him? Because I know sometimes leaders think that they need the pit bull at their side or nobody's going to take them seriously. Good evening, Cindy. Good evening, Joanne. A lot of leaders have a Joab. A Joab is almost a type, not a literary type, but a historical type. Leaders tend to have, every, you know, I FDR had his MacArthur and his Patton, right? Everybody's got their, you've also got your Eisenhower, thank God, but it seems like every leader has a pit bull that they want to keep a pit bull around that they can let off the leash every now and then if things go well, they can take credit for it, and if things go badly, oh, that was him. I had nothing to do with that. But from my experience, once again, I'm just a guy with a webcam and an opinion. I think these guys end up causing more harm for the leader than good. They end up costing them credibility and on the moral high ground when they're trying to lead. So what does this story tell us about ourselves? And the question comes up, do the ends justify the means? I think I've established that, in my mind, killing Abner did not serve David's purposes. Killing Saul's son probably did. But does that mean is it best for the sake of the nation that one man should die, as was asked, when the last week of Jesus' life? Somebody said, better for one man to die for the nation. Do the ends justify the means? Now, in our own lives, we have a tendency to say the ends justify the means. We don't say it out loud, but experience dictates that most people think the ends do justify the means. And I'm actually going to tell you what the moral test is for that. So in ethics, we talk about this thing called a moral dilemma, okay? A moral dilemma is what you call it when there is no way to follow all of your ethics at the same time. Two of your core principles are colliding with each other. If you do the right thing by this person, that's going to result in something bad happening for this person, or something to that effect. Okay. A moral dilemma is not just trying to find a way to explain to people why you did something unpopular. A moral dilemma is when you have to choose between two values, one of which you're going to uphold and the other of which you're going to sacrifice. So you have to decide which one of those values is most important, which one of those rules is too important to break, which one is less important, so is the one that has to give so the other one can be followed. That's what a moral dilemma is. So when you're doing something that is potentially unpopular, the correct moral question to ask is not, do the ends justify the means? The question is, what is the value that I am trying to uphold by doing this? And the people that are going to say I did the wrong thing, what is the value that they are trying to uphold and stopping me from doing it? And which one of those really is the higher value? And the two groups may never agree on that, but you at least need to be able to articulate, because it's very easy to say, well, I know what the core value here is, and I'm just going to defend it. It's very easy to do that when you haven't taken the opportunity, when you haven't taken the time to ask, well, what is the conflicting value with that? What does this story tell us about our relationship with God and with each other? The thing about David is, and the thing that bothers me about the Joab stories, as much as I enjoy reading them, the thing that bothers me about the Joab stories is when you're a leader, and everybody's a leader in certain contexts, okay? Even if you're just the leader of your nuclear family, at some point, you're everybody. There's no way to get through life without leading in some context. When you're a leader, you're responsible for the actions of the people who are under you. So when they do what you say, you're responsible. When they don't do what you say, well, then you're still responsible for what you do about that after the fact. You're responsible for fixing it. If you don't fix it, you're responsible for that. You're responsible for holding that person accountable. If you don't, you're responsible for that. If you know that someone for whom you are responsible is acting unethically, they've established a pattern of doing this, and you do nothing to stop them from doing it going forward, then you are responsible for any further actions that they do. And as a pastor, I've had to make some really unpopular decisions for that reason as well. I remember in one of my churches previously, we had a leader who, let's just say this person, this was a volunteer leader. They had a well-established pattern of behavior, and somebody came to me and was very upset about someone who had been badly emotionally wounded by this person. And she laid out her case. She explained to me what had happened. And I said, yeah, that was terrible. And she said, now I need you to understand something. I'm not mad at the person that did this. I'm mad at the church, because the church has known this person. The church knows this person. And this person has been like this for years, and this person is still in the same position after years. At this point, it's not that person's failure anymore. It's the church leadership's failure to allow this person to continue behaving this way. And she was 100% right. She was 100% right in making that and in blaming us for that. So, we're supposed to exert a positive influence over the people around us. All of us are required to do this. Now, Jesus made it very clear that we're supposed to be willing to eat with sinners, right? But we're supposed to rub off on them. Now, that makes it sound like everybody's either a sinner or a saint, and the saints are supposed to be rubbing off on the sinners. The truth is, most people are sinners in some aspect of life and saint-like in other aspects of life. So when we're hanging out with other people, well, sometimes we gravitate toward people that have the same strengths and weaknesses that we do, and we don't view each other as being sinners because we're the same. But in the life of the church, you might find yourself befriending somebody who does things that you think are sinful and that you would never do. But it could very well be that you do things that they think are sinful and that they would never do. And the hope would be that you rub off on each other in a positive way, that the positive aspects of each person would rub off on each other. That is not what is happening with Joab and David. Joab is bringing out and reinforcing the worst aspects of David's character. There are going to be some times when Joab corrects David in ways that I think are... I can think of two, off the top of my head, I can think of two times in stories that we haven't read yet that Joab confronted David and was right, that Joab's vision was clearer than David was. But generally speaking, Joab is a very bad influence. In fact, from here on out, David's going to get worse as a person. He's about to commit a big sin, and then he's going to follow that up with more sins that are even worse. And the ramifications of these sins will end up, in the long run, destroying his family, destabilizing the nation, and causing all kinds of problems, okay? And the first sin that starts the ball rolling, I don't think David would have committed if he hadn't known that he had Joab around to clean up after him. The second sin he definitely would not have committed without Joab's help. So Joab might see himself as a good friend to David, but he is not, because he brings out the best in David. And I don't know if David considers himself to be a friend to Joab or not, but he does nothing. Well, I shouldn't say that. He chews him out. He chews him out sometimes. That's about all he does to try to put a leash on Joab. Never tries to, help him become a better person. There's a line from a movie. I just said, all David does is yell at Joab. And, well, Joab's been yelled at before. I don't know that yelling at Joab really accomplishes anything. All right, so I think the absence of what does this tell us about our relationship with God and each other? God is, other than His name being invoked, God is not acting in the story, and I think that's a big part of why things are starting to go sideways in this story. Is because it's not that God isn't present at these events; it's that nobody was paying attention to what God was doing or what God was saying. So whatever God was saying and doing didn't make it into the story. Not because God wasn't there doing or saying anything, but because people were not paying attention and did not write it down. So darkness ruled the day. All right, that is it for this week. I hope I helped. The family trees are a little confusing. I hope I clarified that enough for it to all make sense. Those of you who are members of Otterbein know that we have our strategy retreat coming up on February the 3rd. It was originally scheduled for January 27. It's been moved back to the 3rd, so please be aware of that. All of you who are Methodists in the Western region know that the bishop is coming to pay us a visit on the evening of February the 6th. I think I mentioned before that we're looking at the conference is looking at possibly changing the way we're structured, and the bishop is going around the conference to meet people, to listen to people. She's calling them listening sessions. She'll answer questions. She'll explain the concerns that need to be addressed with a new administrative structure. There's talk about maybe changing what a district is, not just changing district lines, but actually changing what a district actually is. Talking about the relationship between our conference and the Peninsula Delaware Conference. So she'll be here at Otterbein, and we are the westernmost point. So if you're in the Cumberland-Hagerstown district or the Frederick district, we would be the place for you to go to meet or listen to the bishop on February the 6th in the evening. It's a Tuesday night. That night, I will not be online because I'll be helping the bishop, which means bringing her what she wants and otherwise staying out of her way. And it is absolutely my pleasure to do that. I love the bishop. All right, so Methodist news tonight. The Lewis Center, Dr. Weems at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership has finished crunching the numbers for the disaffiliations that took place last year, and I'm going to give you some of that tonight. 25% of Methodist churches disaffiliated, which equals about 24% of the church's membership in the United States. What types of churches disaffiliated? What types of people disaffiliated? Oh yes, I always look forward to hearing. Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, I always look forward to hearing the bishop preach as well. All right, so the Lewis Center looked at the churches that disaffiliated and looked at, and drew averages of them, average age, demographics, average size, stuff like that, and compared those numbers to the denomination as a whole. And there were some big differences, and there were some smaller differences, and there were some things that really weren't that different at all. So, for example, it was my impression, and my impressions are going to be skewed because I'm in the Baltimore-Washington Conference, and our demographics are unlike any other conference in the country. We are the most ethnically diverse, we are the most theologically diverse, and we are the most economically diverse, by far, conference in the country. So what happens here is seldom a good reflection of what's going on elsewhere. So it was my impression, looking at the churches around here that disaffiliated, was that there were a few high-profile churches that were pretty good size that disaffiliated, but the rest were very small. That's not actually a fair representation. I've found out from looking at the numbers that the Lewis Center published. So if you look at the average size of the churches that disaffiliated versus the average size of the whole denomination, pretty much the same. If you look at the bell curve of the sizes of the churches that disaffiliated, the distribution of small, medium, and large, and compare that to the denomination, pretty much the same. So as far as the size of the congregations are concerned, that not a factor at all, apparently. But there were some big differences. Almost all of the churches that disaffiliated were American churches. Almost all of the churches that disaffiliated were in the southeast of the United States. And the next big, the southeast jurisdiction alone was half of the churches that disaffiliated. The next big chunk came from the Northwest Texas conference. That one conference, Northwest Texas, lost 81% of their churches to disaffiliation. So between Texas and the Southeast, that was most of the churches that disaffiliated, and just a scattering of churches around the rest of the area. Only about half of the churches that disaffiliated ended up in a denomination. The rest of them, for now, are independent. They're going to wait and see what happens with the new denomination, the new Conservative Methodist denomination, to see how that denomination shakes up before they decide to align with it. The churches that disaffiliated were disproportionately white. Now, in the United States, the Methodist Church is disproportionately white. Not the case in the rest of the world, but because half our churches are in Africa now. But the Methodist Church is disproportionately white in North America. But if you look at the percentage of churches that disaffiliated versus the churches that didn't disaffiliate, the percentage of Methodist churches that are black is much higher than the percentage of churches that disaffiliated. Very few black congregations disaffiliated. Almost all of them were white. Now, so those were the big differences: geographics and racial makeup. There were some smaller differences. The disaffiliating churches were less likely to have an elder for a pastor. They were more likely to have a retired elder or a local pastor, licensed local pastor, or an unlicensed layperson who was volunteering to preach there. They weren't a lot more likely, but they were a little bit more likely. The difference wasn't huge, but they were less likely to have an elder as a pastor. They were also less likely. They were more likely to have a male pastor. They did have a good chunk of women pastors. So this is really sort of in the middle, I guess I should say. So there were huge geographic differences. There were huge racial differences. There were small differences in what type of leadership the congregations had. And in between is the gender of the pastor. So they were disproportionately more likely to have a male as a pastor, and it was a bigger difference than the elder percentage, but nowhere near as big as the other differences. All right, so, and I could have given you numbers, but I don't like numbers. All right, so this is the other interesting thing. They interviewed churches that left and asked them why they left. Now, theoretically, they were only allowed to leave under the separation paragraph over issues pertaining to human sexuality. But when asked why they left, that's not what they said. Okay, some of them said that, but some of them said that the primary reason they were leaving, off the record, was church ownership. Churches that are part of the Methodist Church, they hold their property in trust for the denomination. The denomination owns it. It's the same way in the Catholic Church. A few other denominations are like that. They didn't like that. They want to be like an independent church or a Congregationalist church or a Baptist church where the congregation owns the property, and this was the first time that they had an easy means of doing that. So some conferences made it very easy to disaffiliate. So a church walked away with $1 million property for $25,000 to buy out their portion of the pension fund. Another reason that some churches left was because the pastor of the church didn't want to be Methodist anymore. not so much over theology, but because they didn't want to be under appointment. They wanted to stay as long as they wanted to stay. They wanted to have more authority over their congregation than the Book of Discipline allows them to have over their congregation. They don't want to be forced into retirement when they're 72. They had lots of reasons for not wanting to be Methodist that had nothing to do with theology. Well, all of those things have something to do with theology, but nothing to do with the theology of sexuality. Some of them said that they left for reasons that were not true. In other words, they had been given disinformation about the Methodist Church, and they believed it, and they said, like, I know one of the things in the Southeast was churches were convinced that the denomination was going to come and take their property and sell it out from under them to support other churches, and and that doesn't happen. None of the churches that believed that was going to happen could cite a single instance where they knew that had happened, but that was their big fear. So that was a bit of misinformation that some of them quoted. Some of them just didn't want to be part of a denomination anymore. They wanted autonomy. They didn't want to be part of the Methodist polity anymore. Some of them just didn't feel at home in the denomination anymore. They felt that the denomination had not sent them good pastors, or that the denomination hadn't listened to them. They felt that they felt like outsiders in the denomination. That was their primary reason for leaving. And some of them said point blank, we don't want to pay apportionments anymore. We want to be able to spend our money the way we want to spend it. So those are all the different reasons that congregations said that they were leaving, other than the reason that was actually legal under the paragraph that we used for separation. So that's Methodist news for you tonight. We've got General Conference coming up. Who knows what will happen? Could be that nothing happens. Could be that lots of things happen. So that, and of course the challenging thing, once again, the way the Methodist Church is set up globally right now, there's one book of discipline what's the easiest way to word this? When things are decided, everybody in the denomination has a say. We vote on laws for the denomination. Churches in North America are required to follow all of them. Churches in other parts of the world are allowed to opt out of some of them. So the churches in other parts of the world are able to pass legislation that they themselves are not necessarily required to follow. And those other parts of the world are much more conservative than we are. So the attempt is going to be made to allow each section of the denomination, each geographic section, to operate under its own book of discipline and just share a constitution. So the constitution would stay in place as it's mostly written, but each region would have its own autonomy to write its own book of discipline. And if that doesn't happen, it's going to be a real mess, because although only half of Methodists live in the United States, but 99% of the money that funds the denomination comes from the United States. So this is untenable. Okay, so North Americans are funding a denomination that can tell us what to do without having to do it themselves. It's untenable, and it cannot go on forever. And if and once again, just like with the last of the specially called one, there's two ways to go about doing this. We can pass legislation that makes everybody a little bit unhappy, but gives everybody a little bit, or we can just go to court suing each other. And then that's a big mess, and that's what we want to try to avoid. All right, so in the coming weeks in our class here, 3 things to talk about in the near future. David finally becoming king of the unified Israel. That still hasn't happened yet. He's only been coronated over Judah so far. He still has to be. They still have to have a gathering of all the tribes and say he's the king of all of us. That's coming up in the coming weeks. David is going to establish Jerusalem as the capital of the new unified kingdom. That has not yet happened. That's going to happen in the coming weeks. And then finally, David is going to move the Ark of the Covenant out of its hiding place and into Jerusalem. All in the coming weeks. And then we will go into a different format for a while. We will be doing Fear of the Other by Will Willimon. I'm going to be doing an in-person class here at Otterbein, which will include the video curriculum. And then I will come back online at 8 o'clock like always and give you guys sort of a summary talk. I can't show the videos online because they're copyrighted, but I can, I can talk about them. So that's what we'll be doing during Lent, starting on February the 13th. Anybody have any prayer requests or questions? Put them in the comments. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. Man, we had a short lesson tonight, but it had a complicated topic, so we spent a while talking about it. All right. So don't forget to email me any other questions you've got. Yes, the question from last week was, who are these people? Did I miss a week? So that was, which was the same thing that I experienced when I started working up the lesson. I thought, have I talked about these people before? I don't remember talking about these people before. So I had to go back and check, and yeah, we did, just not a lot. So very easy to get the family tree of Saul, and the two family trees here, Saul's family tree and David's family tree. Very easy to get them confused, especially when many of the names are not easily pronounced to English tongues. All right, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. I'll pray for Judy. Asked for prayers for her husband Earl having a bad day. Okay, we will pray for Earl. Everybody pray for Earl. God bless y'all. See you next week. If I don't